So welcome and thank you all for being here. The title of my dissertation is Self-Determination and Transportation, the Route to Social Inclusion for People with Disabilities. And for some background, the 30th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which seeks to end discrimination in employment and public accommodations, was just a few weeks ago. But literature shows that transportation is still a major barrier to work for people with disabilities, and the employment rates haven't really changed in 30 years. So transportation problems can vary quite a bit depending on the type of disability someone has or where they live. So there may be a lack of research in this area because it doesn't generalize well. And because the developmental psychology literature doesn't really explore these issues or transportation issues, I'm drawing from other areas, including the mobilities literature, which comes from disciplines like sociology, geography, urban planning, and public health. And most mobility research omits disability completely, but when it is mentioned, it's most often treated as a risk factor for social isolation. So some researchers just group disability, poverty, and geography as ways that people are transportation disadvantaged by a lack of access to transportation. And the literature is also missing a developmental perspective of this relationship between the environment and the individual. So it's not just the environment that shapes the person, but the person also adapts the environment to fit their needs. And in the last decade or so, there's been a new focus in transportation research on well-being and the benefits of travel. But most of this new research focuses on trip satisfaction or mood, which is more related to short-term well-being rather than long-term well-being. But this body of literature also oversimplifies disability, either treating it as a binary variable, focusing on only one type of disability at a time, or just omitting it completely. And when we talk about disability, there are a few different theoretical models that explain how disability is problematized. The medical model has kind of been the predominant understanding of disability from as early as the mid-17th century until about the 1970s. And it focuses on the impairment of the individual and curing them through either surgery or medicine. The social model kind of upended this framework and focused more on the architectural and social structural barriers that people with disabilities encounter. And so in this model, the right accommodations can make it possible for disabled people to function like anyone else. But scholars have found both models to be lacking in some ways, and there are now a couple of different competing models. I prefer the universal model because it recognizes that disabilities don't necessarily go away when barriers are removed. And it also acknowledges that disability is a permanent part of the human condition and that our abilities aren't fixed and will change over time. And universal design approaches also recognize that different access needs overlap in a lot of cases, and sometimes they might conflict. So the way we measure disability, it's only really been measured by the US Census for the last 40 years, and their questions and sampling methods have changed over time. There have been ongoing attempts to standardize one measure with cross-cultural validity, but there still isn't one standard of how to measure disability. So I tried out a couple of different ways to measure disability, and I'll discuss that later when I present the results. So the main theoretical background for the dissertation is self-determination theory, which is a meta-theory of motivation and well-being or flourishing. And so within this theory, I'm focusing on really one of the 6 mini theories, the basic psychological needs theory, and to a lesser extent, organismic integration theory, which describes the process of how we internalize external factors and then change our behavior accordingly. So basic psychological needs theory posits that autonomy, relatedness, and competence are crucial in determining how much people will engage with the tasks associated with different domains. So the theory has been applied to studies of workplaces, relationships, personal goal setting, and other areas. And there are a couple of previous transportation studies that hint at this theory or touch on it, but they have mixed results as to which needs are most important or if all 3 needs are necessary. So this study attempts to measure the factors that thwart and support fulfillment of needs in transportation to understand how these measures interact and affect well-being. And the site of the study is New York City, which provides a lot of different options for travel, but also comes with many challenges. And it's also the impetus for this research because I learned how frustrating daily travel could be after interviewing people with physical disabilities for my master's thesis. For the last few years, I've also been doing a lot of advocacy work to put pressure on the MTA to improve the accessibility of the subway. And this is an Elevators Are for Everyone campaign that I've been involved with that is found on Google image search. And I also have a personal interest in the topic because I was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis 12 years ago. And so my interest now has expanded from obstacles for wheelchair users to understanding all kinds of access barriers for people with all kinds of different disabilities. And it's not hard to find examples of how transportation here in New York City can negatively impact feelings of autonomy, relatedness, and competence, especially when you're looking at how people with disabilities get around the city. So the goals of the dissertation are to adapt basic psychological needs theory to transportation, explore how the measures affect well-being, and understand how disability impacts those relationships. And the first study is focused on development of the measures. The second study examines how they relate to well-being, and the third study examines the measures in relation to data from a travel diary, which measures mood and travel obstacles and delays. And data come from 2 surveys and the week-long travel diary. I used convenience sampling and I oversampled disabled participants. So I wanted to get at least as close to as an even sample of disabled and non-disabled participants for each study. So since the first study was focused on the measurement of basic psychological needs, I tested this through the 2 iterative online surveys and used confirmatory factor analysis. And briefly, for those who are unfamiliar, confirmatory factor analysis is used to analyze latent variables that might influence how someone would respond to items on a 5-point scale. And because we can't directly measure the latent variables, we're looking for patterns in how people answer items that are conceptually related. So here are a couple of examples of the individual items that might appear on one of these scales. So the first one is, has to do with difficulty with transportation barriers in the autonomy domain. In this case, the level of difficulty with the distance someone has to travel. And then the second item is on the fulfillment side, and it asks about how people would assess their transportation options in order to understand if their need for autonomy is fulfilled. So in this conception, in this model, autonomy, relatedness, and competence are conceptualized as 3 distinct but related measures. And some studies that use basic psychological needs theory have found that the factors were not unique enough. And so the items were all part of one big basic psychological needs factor. Other models have compared the 3 needs with an additional dimension of satisfaction or dissatisfaction. But I went with the former approach and created 2 separate models to measure the thwarting side and the fulfillment side of basic psychological needs. So the measures for the first study, the first scale was to measure the items or the factors in transportation that thwart basic psychological needs. And this measure was based on a lot of different articles and studies that describe the different types of obstacles that people with different disabilities typically encounter in transportation. And the second measure, the balance measure of psychological needs fulfillment, is an existing measure which was adapted to apply the prompt to the context of transportation. And then I also included 3 individual measures that are also related to the 3 individual needs. So these are perceived accessibility in transportation, self-efficacy, which was adapted to a transportation context. And in the first survey, I included a measure of disability identity to see if it was correlated with relatedness. And then in the second survey, I changed it to an everyday discrimination scale in order to get a more general sense of relatedness that wasn't just about disability. So the final measures that I analyzed, the balanced measure of psychological needs had a poor fit when I did the analysis. So I ended up using the 3 subscale measures to create an alternative measure of basic psychological needs fulfillment. And these are the 2 measures that I ended up with and analyzed for the subsequent studies. And so I'll refer to these acronyms TTBPN as the Transportation Thwarting Barriers, or Thwarting Basic Psychological Needs scale, and the ALT-BPNF acronym for Alternative Basic Psychological Needs Fulfillment Measure when I get to the results. So the first survey had 297 participants, and 179 of these were people with disabilities. And the second survey had 211 participants, and 92 were disabled. I fit a 1-factor and 3-factor model for both the transportation barriers and balanced measure of psychological needs from the first survey. And the fit statistics, which are highlighted at the top, are most commonly used to assess if the models are specified correctly and measuring what we intended it to measure. So as I mentioned previously, the balance measure did not have a good fit, and it also had poor internal reliability of individual scales. So I didn't use that one in the following survey. The 3-factor model of transportation barriers had the best fit. And so I calculated the chi-square difference between the 1-factor and 3-factor transportation barriers scales and found that they were significantly different. And for the second survey, I focused on the 2 3-factor models using the individual subscale measures as the alternative basic psychological needs fulfillment measure and the modified transportation barrier scale. So the transportation barrier scale actually ended up with a slightly worse fit than the initial survey, but there were some issues with missing data for items that didn't apply to some people in the samples, which reduced the statistical power. And so going to the second study, I calculated average scores for the final items for the TTBPN, ALT-BPNF, and well-being measures for each participant using the complete cases, meaning that if someone didn't answer any of the items, their average was based on their other responses. And so my research questions for the second study are about the relationships of these 3 measures and whether the relationship between transportation barriers and well-being is mediated by fulfillment of basic psychological needs. And I also wanted to know the degree to which this relationship varies as a function of having a disability. And a second exploratory question is about which types of disabilities are more likely to be associated with transportation challenges. So the first hypothesis was that transportation barriers would be inversely correlated with basic psychological needs fulfillment and well-being. And the correlation matrix shows that this is true. So we can see that disability status is correlated with both transportation needs measures, and income is also correlated with flourishing. So since income was so highly correlated with the outcome variable, I included that as a control variable in the models where flourishing is the outcome. And so the second hypothesis was that basic psychological needs fulfillment would mediate or explain the relationship between transportation barriers and well-being. So in order to establish that there's a relationship to mediate in the first place, I calculated a regression model, and this shows that the transportation barriers were significantly related to the outcome of flourishing after controlling for income. And the second regression analysis also includes the mediator, which is the fulfillment of basic psychological needs and transportation measure. And when we include this variable, you can see that the effect of transportation barriers on the outcome of flourishing becomes 0. So most of the relationship is really explained through this process. So this is the full mediation model, and it shows that the transportation barriers are negatively associated with fulfillment of basic psychological needs in transportation, which is positively related to well-being. And income also has a positive relationship with well-being. So if we go back to the organismic integration theory, this process explains how the barriers are internalized through the psychological process of assessing basic psychological needs fulfillment. So if transportation barriers negatively impact fulfillment of basic psychological needs in transportation, that in turn will negatively affect flourishing. And to test the third hypothesis, I included the interaction of disability on the mediated path, which moderated or changed the strength of the effect on the mediated relationship. And when we compare the average indirect and direct effects for the two groups, the mediated effect, which is labeled ACME, was only significant for participants with disabilities. So this means that while some participants without disabilities may also experience this mediated effect of experiencing transportation barriers, processing it through an assessment of needs fulfillment, and then their well-being being affected by that process. Based on this sample, the group as a whole did not have this effect.
Hey, Jessica, can you remind me the disability is coded as 1 or non-disability as coded 1?
Disability is coded as 1, yes.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, so if can, all right. So yeah, we can ask a question later. So yeah.
That's okay. If you have another question, I can take it now.
Okay, so can you go back to the diagram?
Yeah.
Yeah. So here, disability W2 moderates this, and that effect is 0.35. That's positive. So how can we explain this? So this means that for disabled person, the effect of fulfillment will be higher.
Yeah, only on the relationship between the basic psychological needs fulfillment and flourishing. So it seems like there's a stronger connection for people with disabilities between this needs fulfillment and flourishing than for people without disabilities.
I see. Okay. Yeah. I think that makes sense. So that means that for disabled people, the psychological needs fulfillment that is more important for normal people.
Yes, it's
for their flourishing or well-being.
Right. So if we go back to the mediation output, it seems like the negative relationship with transportation barriers and well-being really affects people with disabilities. So even though the basic psychological needs fulfillment is mediating the relationship, they are probably more likely to have less fulfillment of basic psychological needs as a result. And so when we look at only the non-disabled participants on the bottom, you can see that the mediated effect is not very strong at all, and it's not significant at the adjusted level that we're using. So it seems like there are some people that may be affected by this, but overall, on average, this sample of 106 people without disabilities weren't really affected by the transportation barriers.
Okay. So in the diagram, the is the direct effect?
Yes.
Direct effect, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, good. Thanks.
Okay.
Oh, by the way, so like in the tables in the future for publication, can standardize the number of decimal to be consistent with the APA format?
Yeah, this is something I talked with Kristen about. I need to go through the whole thing because I am using a correction for multiple comparisons. So instead of a 95% confidence level, I'm using a 99% confidence level. So I just need to make it more consistent throughout. I agree.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you. So to continue, when I got to the exploratory research question about disability types, I really was kind of curious to see if there were any differences in terms of whether there are disability types that are not typically included in transportation research, which tend to primarily focus on physical disabilities, blindness and low vision, and developmental disabilities. So I used data from both of the surveys and analyze them separately since the measurements changed between surveys. So this data is from the first survey, and I asked about if people had these different types of disabilities. So they could choose from a checklist of, which types of disabilities do you have? And it was physical, blindness or low vision, deaf or hard of hearing. Those two were kind of categorized as sensory disabilities. And I also included developmental disabilities, chronic conditions, and mental health disabilities. And so on the coefficients in the first column, these are the coefficients for the multiple regression, which means that they change depending on the other variables in the model. So I'm comparing the entire sample, so it's basically people with or without physical disabilities, people without blindness or low vision, etc. So in the first column, you can see the regression coefficients. So the ones that are most significant are the physical blindness and low vision disabilities. And in the far right corner, or far right column, these are the zero order correlations, meaning that I'm just comparing the correlation individually across these variables. And you can see that those are all significant on their own, but I'm not sure how much that really tells us. And in the first survey, I had a follow-up question about different kinds of functional limitations that people, their disability affected when they were using transportation. And these results pretty much align with the earlier results, which show that the sensory disabilities and physical disabilities seem to have the most significant relationships with the transportation barriers. And from the second survey, I used the Washington group measure. And so this measure is one that is attempting to kind of standardize this measurement of disability. And so they ask people to rate difficulty with functional limitations like seeing, hearing, walking, remembering or concentrating, and self-care. And there are additional disability types that are included in a longer form, which I adapted to kind of look at the same level of difficulty. And I kind of split those disabilities out separately just for statistical power. And so this one is kind of the more conventional types of disabilities. And, we can see that on their own, most of these are significant, but the self-care really stood out as being the most significant in a multiple regression. And so for the second part of the analysis, I coded a new variable that included those previous disability types because the sample is definitely not, I didn't have people neatly fitting into one bucket or another. So there are people that had different disabilities. So I included a control variable with these other kind of conventional types of disabilities to see what other additional types of disabilities stood out. And communication and fatigue were two different kinds of disabilities that probably have a relationship with transportation barriers. But again, it's hard to make conclusions based on the sample size. So for the second study, a couple of the conclusions were that the transportation barriers were inversely related to basic psychological needs fulfillment and well-being, even after we controlled for income. And the relationship is kind of what we expected, that needs fulfillment mediated the relationship between transportation and transportation barriers and well-being. But the effect was really only significant for the participants that had disabilities. And then when we look at the different disability types, those that are found most often in the literature are also the most affected by transportation barriers in this study. And so going into the final study, I conducted a week-long travel diary, and participants also took the second survey as part of the study. So among other variables, participants were asked to record their best and worst trip for each day if they had traveled anywhere, and then to also report obstacles and delays that they encountered, and to record their mood after their best trip and their worst trip. And so the research questions are, do people with disabilities encounter more obstacles and delays than people without disabilities? And then if they did, do they experience mood differences as a result? And I also wanted to understand how mood, which is the short-term measure of well-being, was associated with the transportation barriers and basic psychological needs fulfillment measures. So for this study, I spent a lot of time developing this digital travel diary method, which I detail in the dissertation. And it uses two freely available tools, which are Google Maps and PACO, which is an acronym for Personal Analytics Companion. And it's really just a programmable app that you can put your own research questions into and set like a reminder for when people need to fill out a survey. And so I was able to collect GPS location history and the corresponding qualitative information about specific trips that people took. So that's the data that I'm using for this third study. And I had a total of 74 people who completed all of the steps. I did have a few missing entries that had to be dropped. Some had only partial responses, so they didn't include either the mood or obstacle and delay information. And then there was one person who didn't take any trips at all during the week. So those cases were removed. I had 394 total trip entries among all the participants, and the average number of entries was 5.84 and the median was 6. So this was pretty good compliance for a week-long study. And participants were paid $25 for their participation in both the survey and the travel diary. So again, I calculated a correlation matrix of the variables of interest that I was going to study. And so disability status and the average number of obstacles per day were both correlated with each of the transportation needs measures, which were correlated with each other. The average delays per day were significantly associated with moods during the worst trips, and the transportation barriers measure was associated with moods during the best trips. So to answer the first research question, I ran hypothesis tests to compare the average number of obstacles per day between disabled and non-disabled participants, and the average number of delays per day between disabled and non-disabled participants. And so the results were kind of split. So disabled participants experienced more obstacles on average, but the non-disabled participants experienced more delays on average. So I didn't really analyze those two things together. I analyzed them separately. But the second part of the hypothesis was also not really fully supported. So non-disabled participants had better moods than disabled participants, but only during their best trips. And when I compared the mood during worst trips or the average of moods during best and worst trips, there were no significant differences between the disabled and non-disabled participants. And so because there was variability in the best and worst trip moods and between the delays and obstacles between the disabled and non-disabled participants, I decided to compare the effects of the obstacles and delays for each group on the overall trip average mood. So this was combining the best and worst mood for disabled participants and for non-disabled participants to see how these two different things were affecting people's mood within those groups. So obstacles and delays were both associated with lower overall average trip moods for disabled participants at the 0.05 alpha level, which is significant here because I'm only making one comparison in this analysis. And the delays predicted overall worse moods for the non-disabled participants to a much greater extent than the disabled participants. And so in order to see how the moods were related to the transportation barriers and fulfillment of basic psychological needs in transportation measures, I conducted 2 final regression models. And the first one controlled for delays and disability status, and the second model controlled for obstacles and disability status. And so as opposed to the findings in study 2, where the fulfillment of basic psychological needs in transportation was strongly related to well-being, here the transportation barriers measure had an association with overall mood, but the fulfillment of needs did not have a relationship. And so the second model also shows a similar pattern, with the overall mood being associated with transportation barriers, but not with the fulfillment of needs. And in this model, the interaction of disability status and obstacles was also significant at the 0.01 alpha level, and in a negative direction. So that indicates that the negative effect of obstacles on overall average mood was more pronounced for disabled participants. So to conclude, there were differences in how disabled and non-disabled people experienced and reacted to obstacles and delays while traveling. And non-disabled participants experienced more delays and fewer obstacles than disabled participants, but disabled participants had worse moods during their best trips than the non-disabled participants. The transportation barriers measure was associated with mood while traveling, and it may do a better job of measuring impacts of transportation problems on short-term well-being. Whereas the fulfillment of basic psychological needs measure was not associated with moods during daily travel, and seems to be more aligned with long-term well-being. So some of the limitations of the study overall, I definitely need larger sample sizes to confirm these relationships and also explore differences based on different disability types. I did have some missing data problems in the survey and the travel diary. So this was an issue with measuring the transportation barriers specifically, because some items just didn't apply to people universally. And so some of the travel diary data problems had to do with the GPS location data. So I didn't analyze that data here. And more data would also help to understand how geography contributes to the differences in transportation barriers and in fulfillment of basic psychological needs in transportation. Both of these transportation and psychological needs measures were related to well-being, but this relationship only really existed for people with disabilities. So in the future, I would like to research and include more items that have a more universal impact on autonomy, relatedness, and competence during daily travel. Further refine the measurement of disability, explore severity, multiple disabilities, length of disability, and how that affects transportation barriers and experiences. And I would also like to simplify the diary procedures and further improve that research method. And I'm also interested in how these relationships change over time or after natural interventions, such as accessibility improvements in public transit, or after someone moves to a new neighborhood because they have a tough commute. And there are additional factors that affect well-being that I would also like to explore in further detail. So to conclude, the factors that thwart basic psychological needs were mediated through psychological needs fulfillment. But this type of mediated relationship is not always examined in the self-determination theory literature. And when we looked at how the two measures relate to mood, the inverse was true, with the transportation barrier scale being related to overall average mood, while fulfillment of needs was not related to mood. The disability types associated with transportation problems may be broader than what the literature currently reflects, but I don't think I can draw valid conclusions based on the data that I have. And the differences in how disabled and non-disabled participants experience obstacles and delays and their resulting moods from it may imply that there are different coping strategies between these groups. But the travel diary sample was pretty small, so it would definitely require more research with a larger sample to confirm that finding. And understanding these disparities is really important from a policy perspective. And there's a need to identify the ways that transportation can help disabled people flourish in the future. And that's my presentation. So I'm happy to take your questions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jessica. So we normally start with the external readers asking questions first. If you'd like to jump in.
I have a question in your study one. So when you run SAFE-8, did you combine both disability and non-disability together, or did you separate the data?
I combined it together for the first study.
Okay. Yeah, I was wondering if the modifier is different in terms of two groups. So maybe, in your future supplementary analysis, you can run like, multi-group on CFA to see if there's difference between the two groups in terms of the modifier.
Okay, yeah, I was looking at including other factors in the analysis, but I'm not sure if I have the statistical power necessary. But I would like to talk to you more about that if you have time.
Sure, thanks.
So can I just sort of speak broadly? I'll have some questions in there, but sort of I'm going to respond a bit. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
Okay. So Jessica, first of all, congratulations. This was a lot of work. In reading over this, there were several points where I was like, oh, just this would have been enough for a dissertation, in my opinion. So a couple of things. I like how you are sort of expanding the conversation around disability. You're absolutely right. In the transport literature, it is very sort of age focused, and then sort of also just pretty secondary. And I think one of the things that you mentioned sort of in your presentation, and it comes up through the studies, and I think is maybe from like a policy standpoint, one of the biggest findings is that the fact that the obstacles have no impact on non-disabled people, that's like an enormous thing, right? Like, because it doesn't impinge upon them in any way, policy does not respond to any of sort of those problems. Yeah. And so I like when I think it was in the second article, maybe you sort of found that that finding. I thought that was very interesting. The other thing I'd say is there is some sort of stuff, not sort of transport adjacent, Professor Atto's book being one example, but there's a wonderful article about sort of Chinese immigrants in Queens and sort of their, you know the article I'm talking about?
Where they're saying they may as well be
exactly.
Deaf, yeah, because
right. So the point being is that, and you mentioned this sort of in your piece too, is that it sort of groups together a whole lot of different people, the ways in which they are sort of negatively affected by transport. And so I do think that there's, some bubbling up in the transport field. So a couple other things. One, there's something going on with the way you deal with scale. And so like on one level, you're sort of making theory at a very high scale. But then on another level, you're trying to be very fine grained, and you're talking about sort of finding underrepresented disabilities and sort of trying to understand some of that variation at a very local level. But I feel like some of the methods you're using don't sort of allow you to extract the most from that. And I feel like just knowing you and talking to you about this stuff, that's probably where a lot of your interest lies and where a lot of, I think, future research would be sort of best focused. And then one other sort of thing that I'm sort of curious about, and I think I know the answer to this, but how do you feel, this stuff engages with sort of policy and advocacy, and sort of where would you like to see this going? Is it about amending ADA guidelines, or is it about something else?
I think you had a good point that if it's not really impacting the non-disabled population, that policy is not going to respond to it. So it seems like the MTA is like happy to say, well, it works for most people, so we don't really, this is a really small part of the population that's affected, so we'll do our best, but it's not a huge issue. But yeah, I think when you were mentioning the immigrant groups in Queens, that article was basically, the gist of it was that they may as well have been disabled because of their language literacy, so that they couldn't really understand the signage and information in English because they didn't speak the language. And so they would adopt different coping strategies for riding the subway, for instance, by counting the number of stops that they had to take and trying not to lose track in order to get where they needed to go. So I think there are also, yeah, these other kind of subpopulations, you know, mothers or parents with small children who try to use the subway are kind of one of these groups that are also really negatively affected by wheelchair accessibility or inaccessibility. So I think, yeah, in some ways the scale of what I'm doing is not large enough at all. Part of me kind of wants to be a sociologist and look at these, like, you know, big data sets and try to understand like these kind of broader societal problems. But I think there's, you know, there's definitely, my interest is in the psychological aspects and like how we respond to these challenges and how it affects our day-to-day well-being. So in terms of policy, I think it is important to address that, like, hey, there is this whole population of people that are really negatively affected by these things and are not really getting what they need from transportation, and we need to figure out how to fix that. But what we can also kind of measure the impact of changes. So using it as kind of like, yeah, a way to measure progress in a way. In terms of other policy, like what if there are ADA guidelines that need to change, I think it's not so much about the guidelines as much as the political will and funding that where the ADA is lacking. So I think, you know, they just kind of put this mandate out there, but they didn't appropriate any money to make it happen. And so some of this stuff, I mean, the MTA is always talking about like how expensive it is to do these things, and that's why they're not further along. So I think, yeah, I think that's kind of the missing part. And that's what I advocate for on a different level. But yeah, I think there's some power in saying like, okay, well, now you put this elevator in and here's how this affected the people that live near that elevator. There's definitely potential for stuff like that.
I just had sort of two other things. So one thing, you use the term obstacle and delay, you know, several times throughout. As a non-disabled person, I'm not necessarily sure I know what an obstacle exactly means. So I'm assuming it's an elevator outage or, you know, service is down, you know, something like that. But that is not totally clear to me in the writing. I was just sort of curious. So, I mean, a delay, I think I know what that means, but
yeah. Yeah, and I think that's something that came out of the development of the travel diary. So I did that in a few different phases as well. And the first round or first pilot, I let people kind of just enter in whatever problems they encountered that day while they were traveling. And they kind of fell into these two categories of like, you know, physical obstacles or obstacles like I couldn't get where I needed to go, or I didn't hear the announcement and I missed my stop, or, you know, stuff like that. And then delays were just like the train was late, or the bus was early. I mean, there was these two kind of different types of problems that people were encountering. And so I think the results don't necessarily say that, like, you know, non-disabled people are somehow experiencing more delays. It could just be that the people with disabilities we're just not reporting them as often because maybe they're used to experiencing delays, or it just doesn't register with their experience, whereas the obstacles maybe stand out more and have are kind of harder to control. Like, I think with delays, it's like, yeah, it can give you it can put you in a bad mood, or you can figure out how to cope with it. And there's like all kinds of emotional regulation techniques to just be able to deal with something that's outside your control.
Right, you mentioned that maybe there's better coping mechanisms. And so my last thing is a transportation-y thing. And so sort of the idea of separating out the idea of sort of induced travel demand, sort of being like, I need to go visit my grandmother, right? Like having something that is drawing you to travel versus your ability to travel. Do you have any sense of the sort of why people are traveling in your data? I'm just sort of curious. One other statistic that came up in your articles, in your dissertation, is the job participation amongst the disabled community over the last, since 1998 or something like that, is down 50%. So, oftentimes travel is correlated with having a job and employment, and I'm just sort of curious, is that maybe help explain some of that variation? Obviously, not on the ability part, but on the sort of other side of it. And that's it.
Okay. I do have data about how often people make different types of trips for different purposes, but I didn't analyze it in a meaningful way. But I think I could try to look at that more. I do know that, like, even within the smaller sample or with the survey samples, people with disabilities were traveling on average like 1.5 days less per week based on their responses. And so I think that probably speaks more to the ability to travel. Yeah, I should. I mean, I have more data than I know what to do with, so I'm sure I'll be looking at a lot of this stuff in the future, but that's a good question.
Jessica, did you check the literature in organizational psychology and like how disability has implications in terms of employment and organizational behaviors?
Yeah, there is quite a bit of literature about disability and the workplace, and a lot of it is kind of boils down to accommodations. So typically people with disabilities can't work full-time jobs. Well, I shouldn't say typically. I would say that that's a problem for a lot of people with disabilities, that they just don't have the energy, the stamina to work 40 hours a week. So that's one problem. A second problem is like the location of where they work. There's accessibility issues in many office spaces and office bathrooms and stuff that we don't really think about. So having flexibility to work from home is really helpful for people with certain kinds of disabilities, especially those that have self-care needs, so they need someone to help them with toileting and other things during the workday. And so this is kind of ties into workplace discrimination, because it's like, it's not a usual arrangement, and some employers are uncomfortable with that arrangement. And so, but they're also uncomfortable with giving people the ability to work from home. But I think, it's hard to talk about it now during this pandemic, because now it's like, it's just been a complete reversal. So I don't really know what's going to change in this scenario, but it seems like there's a lot more openness to people working from home. Yeah, and I think it kind of boils down to like the company cultures and like, seeing that people without disabilities also want these accommodations. They would like to be able to work a little bit less, maybe because they have other responsibilities in their personal lives, or they may want to be able to have flexibility in like where they perform their work. So, so it's very complicated. It's not like transportation is the only reason why people are not employed. And I don't want to imply that, because there are other problems. But when there are these, when they do these surveys and ask like, what are the main obstacles preventing you from working, it's usually in the top 2 or 3 reasons that people give.
Okay. How does your research, speak to, for example, workplace, discrimination against disabled persons and stereotype, this kind of thing?
I don't know if it necessarily speaks to those issues, but I think I think I went through some of this in my literature review, that, these reasons that people give, discrimination is also one of the top 3 reasons that people have issues with employment. And, I think transportation, assuming that people can get to work is a pretty fundamental topic for employers. And so if employers assume that people with disabilities may have difficulty finding transportation to work, that might feed into their stereotypes and discrimination.
Yeah, I think especially affect how other coworkers perceive this person's a work ability because of the disability, because of the inability to transport effectively.
Right.
Great job, Jessica. It's really come a long way, and you should be very proud of yourself for pulling this all together.
Thank you.
I had a few questions. I guess the first one where I wanted to just get your thoughts on, you in the first study you set up autonomy, relatedness, and competence as being these distinct but somewhat related components. And then after you set that up and you model it and show that they are distinct, you then go on in the follow-up studies to just combine them into one thing. And so I was wondering if I could just hear your thoughts on the decision to do that and what you would expect to find if you had kept them separate.
Yeah, ultimately it was an issue of statistical power. I think if I kept all of the different variables and incorporated these other ones, I might not have had the minimum count of participants that I needed to analyze that. And that was an issue when I wanted to look at the group differences on the CFA model as well. So yeah, ideally I would be able to include all 3. I'm not sure how exactly to model that, like in a mediation model or moderated mediation model, or if that would just be like an SEM model that includes all of the different variables. But if I guess I would expect that out of the 3, just based on looking at which subscales had the strongest internal reliability and consistency and were most related to the outcomes of flourishing, I would expect autonomy to have the most importance, and competence to have also importance, but not to the same degree. It seemed like relatedness was kind of one of the harder factors to pin down among the 3. So that measurement changed a couple of times. And I think part of the reason that one may not work so well is just that transportation is usually this kind of, I think it's something that most people don't really pay attention to one way or another unless there's a problem. So for the most part, people are not really thinking about how they relate to other people in that setting. Sometimes they're just trying to get from point A to point B. So if they're not actively encountering some form of discrimination while they're traveling, then they're probably not associating their transportation experiences with something that really affects like their social standing. So I think that one would be the weakest of the 3.
Yeah, it makes sense. And I might have missed it when I looked through it or when you were doing your preliminary analyses, but did you look at between group differences on those? So were people who were or were not disabled, were there differences on each of those components separately, and were the differences, did they vary in magnitude across those components?
I did not do that analysis, but I could do that pretty easily, and I can, yeah, I think that's worth looking at as part of it. Yeah.
I think that would be interesting, and it kind of leads into my next question. So I understand, I get that the idea is that people with disabilities are more likely to encounter transportation barriers, and as a result of encountering those transportation barriers, they'll have less fulfillment of their basic psychological needs and lower well-being. So that part makes sense to me. What I would like to hear you expand a little bit on, though, are these the moderation of those individual pathways between the transportation barriers and basic psychological needs, and between basic psychological needs and well-being or flourishing. So maybe I'm missing something, but it's harder for me to understand why the relationship between transportation barriers and basic psychological needs will be more pronounced for people who have disabilities, and why the relationship between basic psychological needs fulfillment and well-being will be more pronounced for people who have disabilities.
I'm going to go back to that slide. I think this is the one we were talking about, right?
Right.
I mean, I think that the people with disabilities, when I looked at the, a relationship between the transportation barriers and well-being, it was significant. So, I think that, like what you're asking, why this relationship would be different for people with disabilities, specifically how it would affect these two mediation paths.
Right. So those in between paths. So I get the overall concept. That people with disabilities are more likely to encounter transportation barriers. As a result of that higher frequency, you're going to see the slower well-being because of the lack of psychological needs fulfillment. But what is less clear to me is why people, with disabilities would have a stronger relationship between transportation barriers and basic psychological needs fulfillment, and why they would have a stronger relationship between basic psychological needs fulfillment and flourishing.
Okay. I guess my only guess at this would be that, that people are experiencing these barriers to a greater degree, and like when they assess their fulfillment of needs, it's just also more likely to be lower because of what they're experiencing. So for that would explain it for the first path. For the second path, I'm not really sure why there would be a stronger correlation for people with disabilities. But it could just be that, when they think about their fulfillment of needs in transportation, that it's much lower than the participants without disabilities.
Yeah, I guess maybe this is something to think a little bit more on. So the first part, I don't know if the higher frequency of encountering it would explain that first leg.
I don't know if it's so much about the frequency, it's more about the level of difficulty. So for this measure, it's like the survey asks about it asks people to rate their level of ease with different aspects of transportation. And so people with disabilities are naturally going to have more difficulty with these obstacles, since most of the items come from literature about people with disabilities and what they encounter.
Right, I get that, but
yeah.
I think that what it's showing here is that it's, regardless of where someone's saying how much transportation barriers they have or basic psychological needs fulfillment, that the relationship between those two is stronger if someone is disabled than if they're not disabled. So I think that's what it's showing, which is different than what you're explaining. And same with between basic psychological needs fulfillment and the flourishing. So I don't know. It's an interesting model and it's an interesting end result, and the overall model makes sense. It's just that those two parts of it, I just don't know exactly what's happening there. I think that there's something interesting and would encourage you to think a little bit more critically about why that might be the case.
Okay. Yeah, that is a good question.
Can I ask a follow-up?
Yeah, sure.
So I remember in the dissertation you talk a little bit about when you encounter an obstacle or a barrier, sort of what do you do? And so I'm just sort of wondering, are there more options for people who are non-disabled? And then does that mean that person has sort of more autonomy? Because you talk about that being sort of the driving force. And I was sort of curious if you looked at any of the sort of alternative pathways for disabled people when they encounter these barriers. Because I think it was just sort of, you just wait. That was one of the big findings. And with non-disabled, sort of walk to another station or something like that.
Yeah, and I think there's the fact that income had such an influential role in both of these models says a lot about the options that people might have. So if you have more money, more resources, it's easier for you to take a taxi when you miss your subway or whatever. And yeah, I think I did measure like people's different coping strategies, and I didn't include this in the dissertation because I wasn't quite sure what to make of it, but the disabled participants were reported about twice as many different coping strategies than the non-disabled people. So I think there may actually be more coping strategies available to disabled people, or they're more used to using these coping strategies to kind of regulate their mood when they're traveling. But yeah, I'll have to think more about like how that affects the non-disabled people. Like what I want to look more closely at the types of obstacles and delays that people encountered between the groups, and also how they responded to those.
Yeah, and what you were talking out there would be potential reasons for both of those moderations. So the first one, what Eric was saying, the idea that there's just less things that people with disabilities can do when they encounter transportation barriers, and as a result, they're more vulnerable to suffering, and their basic psychological needs. And then the second pathway, what you were just saying there at the end, could be a reasonable hypothesis for explaining it, that the people with disabilities, because of their disabilities, they've had to develop all of these extra coping strategies and are more experienced with their coping strategies. And so when their basic psychological needs are fulfilled, they're better able to capitalize on that and translate it into more or better well-being. So those are the types of things to think through. And you're close. It's just it's there, and I think it's a really interesting finding, and would encourage you to dig a little bit deeper into that.
Okay, I think I'll do that. Thank you.
So I'll just echo what everyone has already said, which is congratulations. It's a really impressive piece of work. I should admit, just at the start, my stuff like this confirmation factor analysis, I didn't really know much about it, and so parts of the dissertation were very challenging for me to get through. But even given that, I really see the significance of your work for people who are interested in questions of transit and transportation, and I think it's really compelling. I think just to say a bit more about why I think it's so significant, I think you start off in just the kind of abstract, or just talking about the ways in which focus on how people with disabilities engage with transportation infrastructure, impacts us all. And I think that's actually something you could come back to in the conclusion, just to hammer it home. I mean, if you think about the impact of ADA regulations on drivers and conductors announcing stops, I mean, that benefits everyone. But also, disability being the type of condition it is, all of us, have we all will face challenges, and so that it makes it a unique and important study. I mean, I think there's I think one of the questions I had to do with disability identity, that is, people's identification with the disability identity. And it starts out with, I mean, part of it is prompted by your own discussion of the difference between, kind of a medical model of disability, a social model of disability, and then a universal model of disability. And those aren't, I mean, I think you can correct me if I'm wrong, but those aren't just models. Those are kind of ways in which individuals see themselves and see the world. So if I am someone who is disabled, I can, think of my disability as just my problem. I can also think about it as society's problem that isn't accommodating me, or I can adopt the universal model. Now, I point that out because, that doesn't, my thought was, doesn't that matter for how people experience transportation and experience transportation barriers? That is, so, if I'm a person with a disability who, just to go off the quote that, that's the question you asked in the first survey, I'm not proud of my disability, or I see it as a problem, or, how that the relationship between that and reports of well-being, part of it is just the kind of the evolution of paratransit. You had so many people with disabilities saying, I'm fine with paratransit, I don't want fixed route service, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so I guess my question is really, is there a way in your study to kind of look at the relationship between self-identity, and people's attachment to the disability identity, and kind of their perception of transportation, and if it's thwarting or not? Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah. So I had included that disability identity scale as kind of a validity check for the relatedness measure, but they weren't very well correlated, and the 4 items themselves didn't really seem to cohere together. So I didn't really pursue analysis any further, but I think that's a really interesting question that I could analyze, just taking that part from the first survey, because I had, almost 180 participants with disabilities, and they all answered that question. So yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I know that in prior research, they have found that there are generational differences between how much people align with the social model versus the medical model of disability. Yeah, so I think if I had to come up with a hypothesis, I would assume that people who align more with the social model would perceive transportation barriers as more difficult and have less fulfillment of psychological needs than people who maybe don't identify with it. So I'll have to look back at that measure again and see how if some of the items more accurately capture one model versus the other, and try to compare those two. But that's a really interesting question.
See,
because I think even, just, knowing other people, even on an anecdotal level, there definitely is like a difference between people who want access to the same system that everyone else has, and then people that just prefer to not deal with all the problems.
Yeah, I think, I mean, because I approached it just as, from my own anecdotal experience, so much of well-being, so much of flourishing has to do with, people's expectations,
Yeah.
So, if I'm in Poughkeepsie, my expectations are really low for what transit is going to provide, and so to add another bus, I'm thrilled. But if I'm coming from New York City, and I'll flourish, and I'll report feeling great about the transit system.
Right.
But if I'm in New York and I come up to Poughkeepsie, no amount of added buses is going to make me feel like I'm just going to be constantly thwarted, just because my expectations are so much higher. And so, it was kind of this thing I was reading throughout, through the dissertation of, well, how do you get at people's expectations? How do you get at, and that's a different thing. That's different from people's values, which is kind of what I was talking about before, or social identity. But all those things seem to impact whether we think a 10-minute delay is the end of the world,
right,
or whether it's, or whether that's great, that's fine. I can deal with it. So, yeah, maybe that's kind of off. And maybe it's something you can, in the conclusion or something you can deal with. But I kept thinking, well, so much of this has to do with, well, what do we expect?
Right. Yeah, that's a really good point. I don't know if I think it's I don't know if my data has any insights into that specific question, but I think for future surveys, that's just a really interesting question. To what degree of whatever kind of service do you expect or find reasonable, and then see how that compares to how people are experiencing different obstacles and delays or problems when they travel. Any other questions or suggestions?
Yeah, I had the same kind of questions that Eric had about how this translates to policy, and so, I mean, I was really impressed with your ability to weave in COVID at the end, and kind of, and so, yeah, I thought, the conclusion was really, really strong, in terms of kind of tying things together, and so it was nice to hear your presentation because, as I said, I kind of struggled with a lot of the statistical methods in it, but actually hearing you talk about it was really was more clear. I can't say I'm there yet, but it was definitely, I'll have to read it a couple more times. So, but it was much more. It was very clear, and so yeah. So I think the one other thing I guess is, I think there's some benefit in including in the kind of introduction, a discussion of mobility literature. It seems like an obvious place or an obvious literature to engage with. I also think, just the literature around kind of improving, the practical literature around improving transit. I mean, there's so many questions around how do we get people to use buses, use trains? How do we increase ridership? How do we make our transit infrastructure more welcoming to people? And, what you're dealing with, questions of, motivation seem to deal with those sorts of, it seems to speak to that. And so, it seems like an opportunity, which is, look, I've created this scale, which, potentially could, we could apply to, you could use it to think about how we can improve our service, right? So, So that would be it. Otherwise, it was really, really impressive.
Thank you,
I
Captain.
was just gonna add on to that last comment because again, I think this is for sort of future things and the way you sort of frame what you're talking about. But I do think, you know, you end with basically saying that transit planners and transit agencies bear the cost every time someone opts out of the system, and sort of going to the point of how do you get people into the system. You know, this is sort of one of the techniques you're talking about. And I think that frame, you know, is a really, you know, compelling and important way to sort of like present the research. And obviously, since that's in your conclusion, you sort of see this research as sort of geared towards those types of people. And that's why I think sort of connecting with sort of mobilities literature, absolutely, you know, accessibility, and I mean it in the Susan Handy way of like being able to access different sort of housing and jobs, not sort of, you know, ability to yeah. And then I was also going to add sort of the Xiaolu Yu. There's one other one I thought was a good. Oh, obviously, I think the right to the city stuff that Professor Atto writes about is like, just, I mean, as I read her dissertation, that's all I could think about. I was sort of just like, yeah, this is like people's ability to participate in everyday life. And, you know, Karen Lucas, and they talk about sort of social exclusion without sort of this level of detail that you get into. So I think that there's a lot of really sort of rich, and as you know, there's also a lot going on this issue right now. Like I know that group DRA in New York is organizing some stuff around, you know, subway station accessibility and things like that. And the last thing, sorry, you mentioned you're interested in differences between rural and urban, but I think just sort of outside of New York and, you know, the rest of the country, you know, sort of the stigma of transit is just very, the associations with transit are very different. And so, you know, people in Poughkeepsie, for instance, right, just might be like, yeah, the bus sucks. Anyway, sorry.
Well, I guess going back to what Catherine was talking about earlier about, like how does this translate to policy for transit agencies? Like, how does, like, you know, taking this information and applying it to potential improvements and looking at the kind of more applied research literature. I mean, I have seen in some cities where it is kind of stigmatized to ride the bus. They thought that was like the primary reason keeping people from riding the bus, but when they did a survey, they found out that people just didn't know how to ride. Like they didn't know how to pay the fares or like get on the bus and like, or ask for a stop. They didn't know how it worked. And so they just never tried it. And like, they were intimidated by this like very basic thing that once you do it like just once, it can, so that, yeah, I'll try to find that study. Yeah, there's all kinds of examples like that where, yeah, it's like, you know, some of these issues affect people to a lesser extent if they don't have a disability, but I mean, some of the things on my scale, it was like when I just looked at the individual items and the average scores between people with and without disabilities and a really early preliminary analysis, there were some items that were barely different for people with and without disabilities. And I think it was like being able to understand information about service changes. Like the MTA is notoriously bad at communicating that information. And that kind of makes people feel like incompetent and it's frustrating. So yeah, those are all really good points.
So thank you all. You all gave wonderful feedback. I really think this feedback about linking the big scale and the smaller scale is really important, and problematizing some of the findings a little bit more. And so I wondered also about the opposite relationship between the balanced psychological needs and the barriers across the second and third study. What kind of like underlying mechanisms you feel might contribute to that? And also, if you were to say what the findings of your study would mean to a theoretician, either in the field of balanced psychological needs or maybe in the well-being literature, like what's the key thing your work tells someone in that area? versus like a key take-home recommendation that you would give to the MTA that's very practical, which is kind of a theme I've seen echoed through a lot of the questions.
Mm-hmm. I think I think there are a lot of ways that the MTA or another transit agency could apply these findings, but if we're talking about other people that are studying basic psychological needs theory, it seems like there's just really not a lot of consistency in how that's measured, and sometimes people combine the positive and negative effects all into one factor, so it's like you're kind of losing the push and pull in a way. And so that's what I was trying to do a little bit differently, because to me, conceptually, it seems like there is a process of like the experience of encountering these problems and remembering that difficulty. And then when someone asks you to assess, how much does transportation actually fulfill these needs, and in a more abstract way and a little bit less concrete way, I think there is this kind of, psychological process where people go back and remember the problems they had, and that directly influences their responses to the survey. So I don't think that it makes sense to just combine the thwarting and supporting items all together, because I think you lose that information. And yeah, I should look more closely at these three individual subscales and how they interact with well-being to kind of provide a little bit more detail about which factors are most important. And so in the two cases that I found where people talked about self-determination and transportation, they were kind of just looking at like a bunch of different factors that might affect indirectly well-being, and so connecting that to transport mobility measure of some sort. And in most of these, in the two studies, they were just kind of looking at all these things together and saying, okay, well, these were the ones that had the strongest correlations, and so they're the most important, and not really necessarily looking at the three factors on their own. So I think there is some value in doing that. There were the two factors that came up in one of the studies that were from self-determination theory, were autonomy and competence were very important. And they also found that safety and health were the other two factors that were important. So those things are not really addressed with this theory, the safety and health issues. So I'm not sure how to incorporate those findings. And a different study found that the autonomy wasn't important at all, which doesn't really make sense to me. Because I think it's probably one of the most important, especially because transportation, I mean, even just the word autonomy is like related to automobile, and like there's just like, I don't know, hypothetically, theoretically, they just seem to be very closely related.
So if you were to like summarize your dissertation in a few sentences for someone at the MTA and what it means they should do, what would you tell them?
I would tell them that I developed a scale of barriers that frequently come up in the literature for people with disabilities. And when I asked people to rate their difficulty with those barriers, that people with disabilities obviously experience the obstacles more, but when it came to well-being and fulfillment of basic psychological needs, that they had worse outcomes on both of those, and that the relationship between these barriers and well-being was only really existing for people with disabilities. And so while they think that things may be working pretty well for their customer base as a whole, there's a pretty sizable proportion of their ridership that is not really being served by public transportation. So that they should look more closely at how people respond to these questions, and if they make changes and improvements in the future, they can come back and see if that has any impact on the people that benefit from those improvements. I think that was more than a few sentences, but.
Yes, I think based on everything that people have said, it'd be good in the final conclusion to really like highlight these are the key theoretical things that my dissertation has demonstrated, and then a separate section, these are the key applications, and to kind of like just hit those home a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
Richness here, and you could really highlight what your work is adding,
right,
in a succinct way at the end.
Okay.
Does anyone else have any other questions? Okay, so I guess what we'll do is we'll all migrate over to the Zoom call, and then we'll shut this call, but we need to return to talk to you. So do you want to stay on this call and we'll all shut it? Or should we just write you when we're done and then we can reopen that?
I can stay on if you guys want to rejoin.
Okay.
Later. Okay.
So everyone has the Zoom link, right? So we're gonna all close this one and go to the Zoom link, and then return here to tell her the results of our deliberation.
Okay.
So we'll join the Zoom.
What do you say?
We're going to join you with the Zoom, right?
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right.
Yeah. Don't say anything.
I think everybody's back. Kristen, I think you're muted.
Sorry, I was muted from before. So congratulations, Jessica. Your dissertation was approved with minor revisions. And so I'm going to send you a description of what the minor revisions are. And then the process from there will be just that you submit the changes to me and I review everything.
Okay.
So great work. We can do
Yay.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Congratulations,
Thank you all.
Jessica.
I really
You did an
appreciate
awesome
the
job.
feedback.
Well
Thank
done.
you.
Yeah, great work, Jessica.
Thank you.
And then that's a lot of work. And now it's time to forward, take a race somewhere.
Yeah. After my revisions, I will definitely be taking a break from this, just for a little while.
That's good.
What's your next step?
I don't have like long-term plans at the moment. I am going to be involved in a totally different grant project through the National Archives to develop a resource for high school and college teachers to discuss the history of New York City civil rights history, including disability rights history. So that'll be a complete change of pace, but it's kind of a 2-year part-time gig.
Yeah.
And yeah, I don't know. I think there's definitely a need for more advocacy. In the process of doing this, I actually registered a nonprofit, so I might explore actually turning it into a functioning nonprofit that's focused on transportation advocacy and improving access for people with disabilities through information. I think it's like a really easy, low-hanging fruit that could help a lot of people. So it's kind of open right now.
The part of the grant she's working on was her idea.
Awesome.
It's a really cool grant.
Well, I kind of forced the disability rights angle on the other grant contributors. It wasn't totally my idea. Someone at Teachers College found this opportunity. It's public engagement with archival materials, and so we're trying to make these archival materials that are New York City specific easier to access and use in a teaching capacity. So I kind of said, like, New York City is really the home of so many disability rights history, historical events, and it's not really taught anywhere. I think I learned everything I know about disability rights history once I got to grad school. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to working on this project, which starts next week. So no rest for me. But yeah.
Well, congratulations. We're really proud of you. You did an excellent job.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I appreciate all of your input and insights. And I think it's, with some, these final last touches, I think I'll be really proud of the dissertation. So thank you.
And
again.
you have been working very hard on this, on the 13 project.
Yeah, for a long time.
And thank all of you. You really gave her excellent feedback and very constructive feedback.
I agree.
No worries.
Okay.
All
right. Well, thanks
Congratulations, Jessica.
All right,
Good
thank
luck
you.
with everything.
I could celebrate.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
All right. Bye.
Bye.